Nowadays, we're coming up short of gas. The president says at least 15% short. And the White House wants us to use 25 to 30% less gasoline in our 101 million cars. 3 weeks ago, the president asked everyone to slow down to 50 miles an hour, on our own, without a law, and to save gasoline any other way we can.
October 1973. Americans sit in their cars for hours waiting for gasoline that might not actually come. When it does, they're allowed $5 worth, maybe 10 gallons, maybe less. The images are iconic: lines of cars stretching around blocks, tempers flaring, fights breaking out, gas stations running dry by noon. But the gas lines, the photographs everyone remembers, were just the visible symptom of something much deeper, something that would fundamentally restructure the global economy, reshape global politics, and end an era of prosperity that had lasted for nearly 30 years. I'm Keith Conrad, and this is Sidequests, where I explore the weird rabbit holes I fall down. Today, the 1973 oil crisis, not just the gas lines or the economic recession, but the moment when the post-World War II economic order collapsed and the modern world began. This is the story of how one year changed everything. To understand why 1973 was such a shock, you need to understand the world that came before it. From 1945 to 1973, nearly 3 decades, the Western economies experienced something unprecedented: sustained, broad-based prosperity. Here in the United States, unemployment averaged around 4 to 5%. Sound familiar? Real wages rose consistently. Home ownership became achievable for the middle class. A factory worker could support a family on a single income. Over in Western Europe, it was the 30 glorious years. Reconstruction after World War II became expansion. Social safety nets were built and expanded. Living standards rose faster than at any time in history. The economic consensus was that governments could manage the economy. Recessions were temporary and fixable. Growth was the norm, not the exception. People born after 1945 grew up in a world where things got better every single year. Your parents were better off than your grandparents. You would be better off than your parents. Your children would be better off than you. It was an assumption. It was a certainty. It was just the way the world worked. And then in October 1973, it just stopped working. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel. It was called the Yom Kippur War. Israel was caught off guard and struggled initially. The United States and several European countries sent military aid, weapons, ammunition, supplies. The tide eventually turned and Israel pushed back. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, retaliated, not with weapons, but with oil. They announced a complete embargo on oil exports to the United States, a 5% reduction in overall oil production each month, price increases for everybody else. To target any country that had supported Israel, which was basically most of the West. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. For oil prices, in October of 1973, oil was at $3 a barrel. In March of 74, it was up to $12 per barrel. That's a 400% increase in just 6 months. To put that in perspective, if oil were $75 per barrel today, that would be like watching it hit $300 in 6 months. But it wasn't just the price, it was the realization, sudden, shocking, and undeniable, that the entire Western economy was built on a resource controlled by other countries that could just simply turn off the tap. The post-war prosperity had been built on cheap oil, and the cheap oil was over. What happened next was something economists didn't think was possible: stagflation. Stag from stagnation, low or no economic growth. Inflation from inflation, or in other words, rising prices. Classical economics says this couldn't happen. Either you had growth with some inflation or recession with falling prices. You couldn't have both at once. But in 1973, you did. In the US, inflation hit double digits, over 11% in 74. Unemployment rose from 5% to over 9%. GDP contracted, the stock market crashed, losing 45% of its value by 1974. Interest rates would eventually spike to 19% by 1981. Think about that, a 19% interest rate on a mortgage or a car loan or on business debt. If you wanted to borrow money to start a business in 1981, you were paying 19 cents on every dollar every year just in interest. The economy didn't just slow down, it completely seized up. In the UK, it was even worse. Inflation hit 25% in 75. Industrial production completely collapsed. Coal miners went on strike. The government imposed a 3-day work week just to save energy. By 1976, Britain had to go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The IMF, the fund created to help developing countries in crisis, and Britain, a major world power, a G7 economy, had to actually beg for emergency loans. In other Western countries, France, Italy, Germany, all experienced severe recessions. Japan, completely dependent on imported oil, saw its growth rate completely collapse. And wasn't temporary, it lasted for years. The 1970s became known as a lost decade. Prices were rising, wages were stagnant, unemployment was high, standards of living were falling. For people who'd grown up expecting things to get better every single year, this was psychologically devastating. The social contract, work hard, prosper, pass something better on to your kids, it just felt broken. The oil crisis changed how people lived immediately and visibly. Cars in 1973 averaged 9 miles per gallon. Think about that for a second. 9 miles per gallon. A tank of gas got you maybe 150 miles in a big American sedan at the time. When gas prices quadrupled, and gas wasn't always available even if you could afford it, those cars became liabilities. The U.S. government responded. They put in a nationwide 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to save fuel. Daylight saving time was extended year-round briefly to reduce energy use. Cafe standards were mandated, and the Department of Energy was created. But the biggest change came from consumers. Japanese cars. Honda, Toyota, Datsun. Small, fuel-efficient, reliable, boring by any American standards. No V8 engine, no chrome, no style. But the important thing was they got 30 miles to the gallon. In 1973, Japanese cars had about 5% of the U.S. market. By 1980, they had 25%. The American auto industry, Detroit, the Big Three, the backbone of American manufacturing, was being gutted. It wasn't because of government regulations or unions, but consumers who needed cars that didn't bankrupt them at the pump. And the U.S. auto industry never fully recovered. Detroit would limp through the 80s and 90s, shrinking, laying off workers, losing market share. The 2008 financial crisis nearly killed it off entirely. But the seeds of that collapse were planted in 1973. But beyond gas lines and fuel efficiency and recession, the 1973 oil crisis created something that shapes the world today: the petrodollar system. Here's how it works. Before 1973, oil was priced in various currencies. OPEC countries could demand payment in whatever they wanted. After 1973, the U.S. made a deal, primarily with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer at the time. Oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the U.S. would provide military protection and support. This meant every country that wanted to buy oil had to hold U.S. dollars. Oil-producing countries accumulated massive dollar reserves. Those dollars were recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds and other dollar-dominated assets. The effect was the U.S. dollar became undisputed as the global reserve currency, not because of American economic strength, our economy was in crisis, but because you needed dollars to buy oil and everybody needed oil. This gave the U.S. enormous power, the ability to print money that the world would accept, influence over global interest rates, the ability to impose financial sanctions by cutting countries off from the dollar system. It also meant American foreign policy in the Middle East became permanently entangled with oil, protecting oil supplies, maintaining relationships with oil producers, ensuring the petrodollar system continued. Every American military action in the Middle East since 1973 has had this context. It's not the only factor. Geopolitics is complicated, but the oil dynamic established in 1973 is always there somewhere. The modern global financial system, dollar dominance, Middle East instability, oil geopolitics was born in the 1973 crisis. The 1970s were politically traumatic for the West. The economic consensus collapsed. Government management of the economy seemed to have failed. Stagflation wasn't supposed to be possible, but it was happening. And into this crisis came new ideologies. Margaret Thatcher in the UK, free markets, privatization, deregulation, break up the unions, cut government spending, let the market work. Ronald Reagan in the US, similar message, government isn't the solution, it's the problem. Tax cuts, deregulation, private sector growth. This was a fundamental rejection of the post-war consensus, the idea that governments could and should manage economies for full employment and stability. That idea completely died in the 70s. The modern economy, deregulated finance, weakened unions, privatized services emerged from the wreckage of the 1973 oil crisis. You might think it's a good idea or bad, but it's the world we live in today. The 1973 oil crisis didn't cause everything that followed. History is just never that simple. But it was an inflection point, the moment when the post-war order broke, when prosperity stopped being automatic, when the future stopped looking better than the past. It created the petrodollar system that still dominates global finance, the U.S. Middle East relationships that still drives geopolitics, the economic ideology that still shapes policy, the sense that things could get worse, not better. The gas lines were real, but they were the least important part of the whole thing. 1973 was the year that changed everything, and we're still living in the world that it created.